Now that you've got your GitHub account set up, it's time to make your first public repository, namely by putting your Reflections repository up on GitHub. Like with many cloud-hosted systems, this will involve syncing between the repository on your computer and the version hosted on GitHub, which is the version you will see on the website. When interacting with GitHub, the information you send and receive is in the form of Git commits, so changes must be staged and committed before they can be sent. You may notice that I didn't draw a working directory or staging area for the GitHub repository. These exist for every repository, but since the GitHub repository is hosted on GitHub's servers, they're not directly accessible, so they aren't really relevant here. Unlike with many services that sync with cloud-hosted versions of your files, when using GitHub, you'll need to choose when and how to get the two versions in sync. You can think of this as being similar to how Git lets you manually decide when to save a commit. If GitHub automatically got updated with your local version after every single commit, you might end up making things public before they're fully ready, since new features often require multiple commits. So, since syncing doesn't happen automatically, how do we sync between the local copy of a repository and the one hosted on GitHub? In particular, how can you get the current state of an existing repository onto GitHub to begin with? You might be tempted to answer git clone. That's how we got a copy of a repository from GitHub to local back in lesson 1. This would be a pretty reasonable guess to make, but it turns out that GitHub doesn't allow directly cloning onto their servers. So instead, first you'll need to create an empty repository on GitHub. Don't worry about actually doing this right now. The important part is to think of an empty repository in a known location for the moment. To allow for syncing data between two repositories, Git has a concept of a remote repository. This lets you store the location of a repository that you will want to send and receive new commits to and from. Git users often refer to these remote repositories simply as remotes. You will see how to set up a remote soon with Caroline, but for now, I'll represent the connection between the two repositories with an arrow. So, what kind of interactions can you have with a remote? Well, you can push data, and you can pull data. I mentioned earlier that what you send and receive from remotes are commits. But instead of selecting each individual commit, the most common way to send and receive data is by specifying a branch. So in the case of this repository, and most likely your Reflections repository as well, all we need to do is push the master branch, and all the commits will be sent, since they're all reachable by the commit at the tip of master. So when you push master, both of these commits will show up. If either of these commits had already been on the GitHub servers before we ran the push command, Git wouldn't have bothered sending it. You can imagine that if you had a large repository with hundreds or thousands of commits, it would be very inefficient to send every single commit every time. Just to make sure this concept makes sense, let's look at a hypothetical situation. If I had this commit history locally, and this GitHub repo set up as a remote, then pushed branch A, which commits would need to be sent? Note that here I'm representing both repositories just by showing their commit histories, since communication between repositories only happens at the level of commit history, so it's not necessary to show the working directory or staging area for either of them here.